We've all become familiar with the term risk assessment, and most people have been involved in at least a few of these assessments at work. Very simply, a risk assessment is done by identifying how people could be harmed and then working out the best ways to prevent that harm. Doing a risk assessment properly will ensure that everyone involved has a say in how things are done and that the chosen method of doing that task is acceptable and safe for everybody. That's why the law requires that businesses do them. So how do we do a risk assessment properly? The ISO standard on risk management, ISO 31000, puts risk assessment at the core of a larger process, the risk management process. It's a cyclical process driven by monitoring and reviewing risks, which ensures that continual improvements are made and that any changes or new risks are taken account of. It's important to note that this monitor and review aspect, as well as the communication of risk information, should be done at all stages of the process. It starts with setting the context, which means making sure that everyone's happy with the descriptions for consequence and likelihood that you're going to be using, and that the risk matrix is suitable. It also means deciding upon what you're actually going to assess. If you're not 100% clear on what's being assessed, then you're likely going to end up wasting a whole lot of time and energy and come up with answers to the wrong questions. Another thing to consider when setting the context is who to include in the risk assessment. Ideally, you'd include a range of people with knowledge of the task being done, and people who have the authority to make decisions about resources. A risk assessment will stall quickly if the group decides that they need a certain item but nobody can actually provide it. So you've got your group together and you've decided on a task that you need to assess. The first stage of the actual risk assessment is to identify the hazards that we're dealing with. If this is a task that's been done numerous times in the past, there's likely to be good knowledge of what hazards are present. If it's a new task, for example, a new piece of machinery or equipment, then start by reading the manufacturer's guidance. Then brainstorm any of the other hazards that may be present in your own particular situation. Checklists and prompts can be useful to help identify some of the less obvious hazards. For each hazard, you need to answer the question, how can this hazard cause harm? The answer to that question will tell you the risk issues you're about to assess. Before you assess the level of risk, it's worth thinking about the things that you already do to make that task safe. These are called the existing risk controls, and in lots of cases, these might be all that you really need. So the first stage of the risk assessment is identification of hazards, risks, and controls. The second stage is to analyze the risks. That means you assess the consequences of the risk issues and the likelihood of that happening. With that information, you can use the risk matrix to calculate a risk score. The last stage of the risk assessment is to evaluate the risks. That means that you're going to decide what you're going to do about them. For risks that fall low down the scale within the green area of the matrix, you're most likely going to accept them as they are with no additional controls. Whereas risks that fall in the middle area, represented in yellow or orange, you should be applying that ALARP principle to reduce these risks as much as reasonably practicable. For risks that fall in the upper area, in red, you're not going to do that task until you've developed a way to bring the risk level down to more tolerable levels. So if you've decided that better risk controls are needed, it's worth using a thing called the hierarchy of controls to help choose the most effective controls, and we'll look at that in the next lesson. It's actually a fairly simple process, and the more of these that you do, the quicker and more effective they'll become. And in the next few lessons, I'll show you some tools to help make doing risk assessments more effective, easier, and less time consuming. Before we go any further, take a look at your health and safety management system and scroll down to the section on risk management. Have a look at the risk matrix and the descriptions for the terms used. These are generic and generally useful for most businesses, but make sure that you and the other people you work with are happy with these. Modify them to suit if you want to. That's an essential part of setting the context for your risk management activities, and it will help you to get the most out of any risk assessments that you do.